I know that kids can be odd sometimes. I was waiting for my bus the other day, and I had my headphones in, looking down the road in the direction where the bus would be coming from. As I turned around, there was this girl who was about 8 who was standing right next to me. So I sort of reacted surprised. She just looks at me, not smiling, and says,
"You're really pretty."
So I'm thinking, oh, that's really sweet. Kind of weird, but no harm done. That was until she goes on and says,
"I'm going to rip your face off."
I wasn't really sure how to react, so I gave her a weird look, and I'm pretty speechless. I see someone who I assume was her father, standing at the edge of the street, just watching us. The girl sees me staring at the man, so she turns around and starts absolutely screaming her head off at him. The man looks at us and then bolts away. She then turns back to me, still not smiling, not crying, not sad, and then runs after the guy. Possibly one of the weirdest experiences I've ever had. Fast forward to earlier today. I'm about 2 or 3 suburbs away from the bus stop, and I'm just hanging out in front of my friend's apartment building, having a cigarette while I'm waiting for him to come down, when I see that same little girl walking towards me. She looks at me the whole way until she's in front of me, and then says,
"I know you."
And then I'm like, what? She stares at me for a few minutes, just watching everything I do, following my hands when I move them, and then looking back at my face, staring at my feet, almost as if she was sizing me up. It was completely awkward. I didn't know what to do but to just look back at her. I didn't really want to walk away because I'm not scared of a little kid, and I just can't leave because my friend is coming back down from his apartment. After a few minutes of the standoff, she gives me a weird frown and narrows her eyes, and then says,
"I'll be back for you."
She then slowly shakes her head, like in a, "Oh, I gotcha" kind of way, and then just walks away. I feel like I just encountered the Antichrist.
I need to get this out because I've kept it to myself for a really long time, and because I want to stress how important it is to listen to your instincts. I'm a female, and I was 10 years old at the time this incident took place. My parents were very religious when I was growing up. I didn't have much contact with the outside world, other than church or when we went to the store for groceries. I guess you could say I was a sheltered child. I'm only mentioning this part so that you'll understand that up until the occurrence I'm about to explain, I had never truly witnessed some of the evils of this world. My parents and I went to a huge Christmas party that my grandparents held every year. Their house was a spacious 2-story Victorian and would always be full of other family members, along with the many friends my grandparents invited. My grandmother would go all out with decorations, and every room had a different Christmassy theme to it. I was pretty introverted, so to amuse myself, I was walking around quietly, observing the decor, when Uncle Andy came up behind me. "Well, my, look who we have here," he declared loudly, which startled me and had caused me to jump slightly. Turning to face him, I chuckled awkwardly, and I gave him a polite greeting. He immediately leered at me with the same sheepish smile he always did. For some context, he was not my immediate uncle. Everyone just called him Uncle Andy. However, he was related to my grandfather in some way. The best description I can give is that he was a tall man with salt and pepper hair, who, looking back, reminded me a lot of Jeff Goldblum. But I digress. Uncle Andy began asking me the usual questions. How was school going? What did I want for Christmas? Etc. It was when he suddenly reached out and grabbed a piece of my blonde hair that I froze momentarily. Wow, such long, beautiful hair, he amused, as he then brought the strands to his nostrils and gave them a vigorous sniff. Thanks, I muttered as I quickly took a step back. Alarm bells were ringing in my head. Nothing like this had happened to me before, but I knew it was wrong. Adults are not to touch children in this manner. I forced a weak smile as I then explained that I needed to help my mom with something. Uncle Andy, who was blocking my path at the time, never once dropped a smirk, as he then said, "Very well, but not until you've given me a proper handshake, young lady." I swallowed hard, and I'm sure my eyes widened in response. Even so, I figured it was the only option to get him to move. "Fine," I replied as I held out my hand. He locked my hand tightly with his, and he gave it a shake. I began to tug away, but not before he stroked the back of my hand with his thumb, all while maintaining really strong eye contact with me. He finally let go and stated, "See you around." I darted past him, frantically looking everywhere for my mom. After finding her in the kitchen, I told her that I needed to tell her something important, but she was in the middle of cooking 3 different things at once. Tons of the other relatives littered the small space and were talking loudly, so it was hard for her to hear what I was saying. She instructed me to go find my dad, and I went to do just that. As I exited the kitchen, to my horror, there was Uncle Andy again in the hallway. A perverse grin was still plastered on his face. I bolted into the dining room, which to my relief is right where my dad and grandpa were at the table. I scooted onto the bench next to my dad for safety. They were having a conversation, and I knew better to interrupt, but I was just happy to be safe for the moment. Throughout the rest of the evening, I made sure to never leave my mom or dad's side. Even still, no matter where I went, Uncle Andy's sight bore right into me. His gaze was predatory. I felt dirty, vulnerable, and like his targeted prey. After that night, every year, I would always make up a new excuse why I didn't feel like going to Christmas parties. Luckily, the few times I couldn't get out of it, Uncle Andy and his family didn't show up. Fast forward to roughly 15 years later, I was chatting with my half-sister on the phone, who always lived in the same town as my grandparents. She opened up to me about the abuse she had gone through in her childhood at the hand of her stepfather. Somehow that led to me telling her all about my experience with Uncle Andy. She gasped and went quiet for a moment, before then telling me that Uncle Andy was arrested earlier that year for lewd child abuse. Apparently he had been abusing his own children for years, but had kept them quiet about it with manipulation tactics. It wasn't until he was caught in the act of sexually abusing his grandchild that his perverted and sick ways finally came to light. My throat felt like it dropped into my stomach. I was floored to say the least. This meant that my intuition had been right. Something was majorly off with Uncle Andy. Even as a sheltered child, I could sense it despite having never been told in depth what sexual abuse was back then. I shared this story to warn you all. If you ever find yourself in a situation where your gut instinct is on high alert, please listen to it. If something just feels off about someone, chances are it's true. Be safe, and don't take the risk of playing it off as nothing. I know that this story may not seem that frightening to some, but I'm thankful every day that I listened to that inner voice that protected me. If I hadn't, I may have very well been one of Uncle Andy's victims if he had ever had the chance to get me alone long enough.
Today I took my 5-year-old son and my 3-month-old daughter to the playground. We were there to meet a friend of mine and her daughter. It's got regular playground equipment, a huge parking lot, and a big grassy area surrounded by trees. On the other side of the trees is some sort of development they're working on. This area is pretty isolated. It's just a bunch of twisty roads and random buildings, I've never thought about or noticed this until today. We get to the park and meet up with my friend. Another mom that we knew was there with her 2 girls as well. The only other people there was a dad with his little girl and boy. I looked to be somewhere between 10 to 12. So the moms are there sitting, chatting, and playing with my adorable daughter, having a good time. The older kids were playing together, and everything was fine. Eventually, all the kids from our group kind of wander off on the playground and do their own thing. The seesaws are in a shady area. Next to them is a big stretch of grass, then the trees with a development area behind them. My son wants to go on the seesaw, but nobody wanted to join him. I get up to go, and the 10-year-old boy, who is not a part of our group, comes up to me and says, "Hi, do you want me to play with your son?" Which was a bit strange that he asked me and not my son. But I said, "Sure, bud. You go right ahead." So he goes to the other side and starts seesawing with him. His demeanor was so strange. This boy didn't smile. His voice was flat, and he didn't say a word to my son. My son was oblivious and was chatting away. After a few minutes, I start walking back to my bench, and I hear the other boy start talking with my son. Okay, so maybe he's shy around grown-ups. I sit down and start talking with my friends. The father of the boy walks near us to probably go up to his car, and I say, "Hey, it was really sweet of your son to go offer to play with mine." And I smile at him. He looks at me and goes, "That boy is not my son. I don't know who he is. He walked over and asked if I wanted him to play with my daughter. And he just kind of followed us around until you guys got here." Weird, right? He shook his head and walked away. I got this very uneasy feeling in my stomach, and I walked over to the seesaws. They were gone. I run back and hand my daughter to my friend, and then took off yelling my son's name. I see them walking towards the trees. I would guess they were a football field or so away from the area. I got this awful feeling, and I ran as fast as I could, yelling my son's name. He turned around and started trying to walk toward me. The boy grabs my son's arm and pulls him towards the trees. He then gets upset and starts yelling, "Hey, let go of me!" Now, something that you should know about my son is that he has ADHD, and he does not like to be grabbed, pushed, or pulled. So when he gets frustrated, it usually comes out in very aggressive ways. And the moment I was thankful for this, he begins punching the boy and headbutting him like a crazy person. The boy lets go, and as I get to them, he disappears into the trees. My friends finally realized something was going on, so they're now standing at the edge of the play area, looking baffled. My son is crying. I'm shaking. I have no idea what the just happened. I asked my son where he was going, and he said that his friend wanted to take him to go see Ryan. He was referring to the guy from Ryan Toy Reviews, his favorite YouTube channel, which he talks about nonstop. He told the boy about Ryan, and apparently the boy claimed that he knew where Ryan lived, then asked my son if he wanted to go visit him and play. So of course my son, not knowing any better, said yes. I have no idea what this kid's intentions were. I don't understand why he would lie to my son like that, and why he wanted to take him into the woods. Maybe this was completely innocent. But deep down, I know it wasn't. This is a memory I've tried to block out, but the other day when my siblings and I were talking about the funny stuff my dad did when he was alive, and how sometimes he would be humorlessly absent-minded as a parent, and this long-forgotten memory came back to me, and I can't stop thinking about it. When I was about 4, I had a playground fall that resulted in a serious cut in the back of my head that needed stitches. A few weeks later, my dad took me back to the doctors to have them removed. I was very brave and sat very still for the doctor, unlike the huge fuss I had made when they put them in. So as a reward, my dad got me an ice cream and took me to the beach. It was a very small Australian town, and the beach was quite secluded. Even though it was the middle of the summer, there was only a handful of slightly older children swimming, mind you, without their parents. My dad walked me down to the water's edge and sternly warned me to stay in the shallow water and to not go any deeper than my knees. Then he disappeared. I imagine he was using the public restroom or something. I know that sounds bad, but he really wasn't a bad father. As I mentioned before, he could just be a bit irresponsible and absent-minded sometimes, but he always meant well. It drove my mom insane. There was an older boy, about 10 years old. He was paddling around a few meters away, but slowly came in closer. He then called out to me. I remembered he had blonde hair and was smiling brightly. He asked me what my name and age was. I answered, also telling him about all the important details about my trip to the doctors that morning, emphasizing that I had been a very brave kid to impress him. My story seemed to amuse him, and he asked why I didn't come out and swim a bit deeper. I explained that I wasn't allowed to go in past my knees until my dad got back, because I couldn't swim very well, and I didn't want to get into trouble. He assured me that I couldn't possibly get into trouble if he was teaching me how to swim, and besides, my dad wouldn't see because he was gone. When I was still hesitant, he added, "Are you afraid? I thought you were brave." So I followed him out until my feet couldn't touch the bottom. He immediately grabbed me and held me under the water. I'm getting angry and upset just thinking about it. I struggled, but he was more than twice my age and my size. I realize now that he had separated from the other group of kids so they wouldn't know what he was up to. Drowning an unattended child is the perfect crime because you could easily pass it off as an accident. Probably only seconds before I lost consciousness, the boy abruptly let go, and my dad lifted me out of the water. I could see the look of bewilderment mixed with fear and rage on his face. Then, for what seemed like a very long time, he patted me on my back while I screamed, sobbed, and coughed over his shoulder. By the time I had settled, and my father was satisfied that I was okay, the blonde boy and the other kids were gone, although my dad still went driving around looking for them. Had that kid stuck around, I'm quite certain my dad would have killed him. Shortly after this, we moved towns. I don't think he ever went to the police, but I can't be certain. All I know is that he never told my mom about it, because she would have lost her shit at him for leaving me by myself. I really do feel that kid seriously meant to kill me. There was something malicious about the way he tightened his hold when I struggled. I felt like he was determined and not messing around.
I want to start off by saying that I'm very open about my past, and I have an amazing support network. I chose to share my story on YouTube to help out others get through similar situations. Nobody should have to feel like they're going through trauma alone. The first 8 years of my life are almost completely blocked off by the events of one night. Even 20 years later, I still remember what happened like it was yesterday. My father was a very angry man who would verbally abuse my mom, older sister, and myself, and occasionally becoming physical with us. One day I was sitting in his chair while watching cartoons, and he grabbed a wooden spoon from the kitchen, and he hit me across the head with it, and the spoon broke. He had actually hit me that hard. He came from a very twisted and evil family. My mom was the complete opposite. I don't remember much of her, but I remember feeling an overwhelming sense of safety and love. During this time, we lived in a country town in Australia on the outskirts of the town. In early 2002, 3 days after I'd turned 8, I had a nightmare during the night. I woke up and I'd walked through the house to my parents' room. I woke up my mom and I told her that I had a nightmare. We then went into the living room and she made the couch for me. We fell asleep almost right away. I don't know what time it was, but I'd woke up to the sound of banging, like someone was hammering a nail into the next room. I then felt a splash of something hit my cheek. I then wiped it away as I was waking up. To my horror, I then saw my father standing over my mom, wielding a bloody hammer, and I then looked to where my mom was laying. There was a bloodied mess from where her head was on the pillow, and this will be forever etched into my mind. I froze and I tried to scream, but I made no sound. I then looked at my hand and I saw that it was blood that hit my face. Then my father covered my mom's head with the pillow to try and hide what he did. I then ran to my sister's room that was across the house. When I got to her room, I tried to tell her what happened, but again, I made no sound. My mind was going a million miles an hour at this point. I remember hearing what I wanted to say in my head, and I was really confused why my sister wasn't panicking. She followed me to where our parents were. My father dropped the hammer and was now calling the police on himself when we ran into the room. My sister was screaming at the top of her lungs when she saw my mom laying there. We could still hear my mom trying to breathe, and I will always remember that sound. My father called the police 3 times to tell them what he did and give them the directions to our house. He also ushered us out of the room to the other side of the house, away from our mom. He caused all this suffering because my mom said she wanted to take both my sister and I and then get away from him. My mom did get us away from him. Unfortunately, however, she paid the ultimate price to do so. He served 12 years in prison for what he did. From the letters he sent us, it was hell for him. One incident that stands out to me was he had used the prison swimming pool when he shouldn't have. Some high-profile criminal was using it, and when he returned to his cell, his bed was on fire. Hearing that, part of me really wished he was in bed when it went up in flames. During late 2011, I was diagnosed with cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and near the mid of 2012, I beat it. Near the end of his prison sentence, my father developed skin cancer, and he got most of it removed. Well, a few years later, it came back and there was a really high chance that he wouldn't survive it. He died in 2014 in the presence of his twisted family. When I found this out, I had felt a huge weight lift right off of me, and I thought it was almost poetic that I beat cancer, but he didn't. Due to the event happening so close to my birthday, I've always really hated celebrating it. I used to really pretend enjoying it when family and friends decided to do something for me during the first few years after this all happened. But later on, I just chose not to do anything. All of my friends and family have always been really supportive over the years, and I've been in therapy for years and dealing with anxiety, depression, and PTSD for the past 10 years. I'm unable to work or have a love life due to very low self-esteem. I was lucky that I found Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at the age of 13, because it hasn't only been a great way to let out my anger and frustration in a controlled environment, but also, my coaches have all taught me how to remain calm when I'm not on the mat. To my cold-blooded father that stole my mother from me, I honestly hope that you're in the deepest, darkest pit in hell.